As you can imagine, convincing my parents to let me spend part of my summer on a tiny island off the coast of Wales was no easy task. Then, several things happened that helped my case enormously. My dad learned that Cairnholm Island is a super important bird habitat, and, like half the world's population of some bird that gives him a total ornithology boner, lives there. He started talking a lot about his hypothetical new bird book, and when the subject came up, I did my best to encourage him and sound interested. But the most important factor was Dr. Golan. After a surprisingly minimal amount of coaxing by me, he shocked us all by not only signing off on the idea, but also encouraging my parents to let me go.
It could be important to him,
he told my mother after a session one afternoon.
It's a place that's been so mythologized by his grandfather that visiting it could only serve to demystify it. He'll see that it's just as normal and unmagical as any place else, and by extension, his grandfather's fantasies will lose their power. It could be a highly effective way of combating fantasy with reality.
But I thought he already didn't believe that stuff. Do you, Jake?
I don't.
Not consciously, he doesn't. But it's his unconscious that's causing him problems right now. The dreams, the anxiety.
And you really think going there could help?
I do.
And that was all it took. After that, things fell into place with astonishing speed. Plane tickets were bought, schedules scheduled, plans laid. My dad and I would go for 3 weeks in June. During the 3-week window between the end of school and the start of our trip, I did my best to verify that Miss Alma LeFay Peregrine still resided among the living, but internet searches turned up nothing. Assuming she was still alive, I had hoped to get her on the phone and at least warn her that I was coming, but I soon discovered that almost no one in Cairnholm even had a phone. I found only one number for the entire island, so that's the one I dialed. It took nearly a minute to connect, the line hissing and clicking, going quiet, then hissing again, so that I could feel every mile of the vast distance my call was spanning. Finally I heard that strange European ring, wop wop, wop wop, and a man, whom I could only assume was profoundly intoxicated, answered the phone.
Hello?
There was an unholy amount of noise in the background, the kind of dull roar you'd expect at the height of a raging frat party. I tried to identify myself, but I don't think he could hear me.
Pisshole, who's this now?
But before I could say anything, he'd pulled the receiver away from his head to shout at someone.
I said shut up, you dozy bastards! I'm on the...
And then the line went dead. I sat with the receiver to my ear for a long, puzzled moment, then hung up. I didn't bother calling back. If Cairnholm's only phone connected to some den of iniquity called the Piss Hole, how did that bode for the rest of the island? Would my first trip to Europe be spent evading drunken maniacs and watching birds evacuate their bowels on rocky beaches? Maybe so, but if it meant that I'd finally be able to put my grandfather's mystery to rest and get on with my unextraordinary life, anything I had to endure would be worth it. Fog closed around us like a blindfold. When the captain announced that we were nearly there, at first I thought he was kidding. All I could see from the ferry's rolling deck was an endless curtain of grey. Then my father shouted,
Look!
And I raised my head to see a towering mountain of rock emerge from the blank canvas before us. It was my grandfather's island, looming and bleak, folded in mist, guarded by a million screeching birds. It looked like some ancient fortress constructed by giants. As I gazed up its sheer cliffs, tops disappearing in a reef of ghostly clouds, the idea that this was a magical place didn't seem so ridiculous. As we drew nearer the cliffs, I began to notice odd-shaped lurking underwater. A passing crewman caught me leaning over the rail to stare at them.
Never seen a shipwreck before, eh?
Really?
This whole area's a nautical graveyard. It's like the old captains used to say. Twixt Heartland Point and Cairnholm Bay is a sailor's grave, by night or day. Sunk by a U-boat she was.
There were U-boats around here?
Loads. Whole Irish Sea was rotten with German subs. Wager you'd have half a navy on your hands if you could unsink all the ships they torpedoed.
He arched one eyebrow dramatically, then walked off laughing. The ferry docked, and we humped our bags into the little town. Upon closer inspection, I decided it was, like a lot of things, not as pretty up close as it seemed from a distance. Whitewashed cottages, quaint except for the satellite dishes sprouting from their roofs, lined a small grid of muddy gravel streets. Because Cairnholm was too distant and too inconsequential to justify the cost of running power lines from the mainland, foul-smelling diesel generators buzzed on every corner like angry wasps, harmonizing with the growl of tractors, the island's only vehicular traffic. At the edges of town, ancient-looking cottages stood abandoned and roofless, evidence of a shrinking population. Children lured away from centuries-old fishing and farming traditions by more glamorous opportunities elsewhere. We dragged our stuff through town looking for something called the Priest Home, where my dad had booked a room. We thought we'd found our accommodations until we went inside and saw that it had indeed been converted, but into a dingy little museum, not a B&B. We found the part-time curator in a room hung with old fishing nets and sheep sheets. His face lit up when he saw us, then fell when he realized we were only lost.
I reckon you are after the priest hole. It's got the only rooms to let on the island.
Where can we find the old children's home?
The old what?
It was a home for refugee kids during the war. A big house.
I don't know about any refugees, but I think I know the place you mean. It's way up the other side of the island, past the bog and through the woods. Though I wouldn't go mucking about up there alone if I was you. Stray too far from the path, and that's the last anyone will hear of you. Nothing but wet grass and sheep patties to keep you from going straight over a cliff.
That's good to know. Promise me you won't go by yourself.
All right.
What's your interest in it anyhow? It's not exactly on the tourist maps.
Just a little genealogy project. My dad spent a few years there as a kid.
I could tell he was eager to avoid any mention of psychiatrists or dead grandfathers. He thanked the man again and quickly ushered me out the door. Following the curator's directions, we retraced our steps until we came to the priest hole. Now, I'm no hotel connoisseur, but one glance at the weathered sign told me that our stay was unlikely to be a 4-star mince-on-your-pillow type experience. We squeezed our bags through the doorway and stood blinking in the sudden gloom of a low-ceilinged pub. When my eyes had adjusted, I realized that hole was a pretty accurate description of the place. Tiny leaded windows admitted just enough light to find the beer tap without tripping over the tables and chairs on the way. The tables, worn and wobbling, looked like they might be more useful as firewood. The bar was half filled, at whatever hour of the morning it was, with men in various states of hushed intoxication, heads bowed prayerfully over tumblers of amber liquid.
You must be after the room, Kev.
We followed Kev up a narrow staircase to a suite of rooms, plural, that could charitably be described as basic. There were 2 bedrooms, the larger of which Dad claimed, and a room that tripled as a kitchen, dining room, and living room, meaning that it contained 1 table, 1 moth-eaten sofa, and 1 hot plate. Kev led us downstairs for the final leg of our tour.
You're welcome to take your meals here, and I expect you will on account of there's nowhere else to eat. If you need to make a call, we got a phone box in the corner there. Sometimes there's a bit of queue for it. Though since we get doodly for mobile reception out here, and you're looking at the only landline on the island. That's right, we got it all. Only food, only bed, only phone.
And he leaned back and laughed, long and loud. The only phone on the island. I looked over at it. It was the kind that had a door you could pull shut for privacy, like the ones you see in old movies. And realized with dawning horror that this was the Grecian orgy. This was the raging frat party I had been connected to when I called the island a few weeks ago. This was the piss hole. Kev handed my dad the keys to our room.
Any questions? You know where to find me.
I have a question. What's a priest hole? Kev walked over to an uneven path of floorboards next to the fireplace, where a mangy dog lay sleeping.
Right here.
He said, tapping what appeared to be a door in the floor with his shoe.
Ages ago, when just being a Catholic could get you hung from a tree, clergy folk came here seeking refuge. If Queen Elizabeth's crew of thugs came chasing after, we hid whoever needed hiding in snug little spots like this. Priest holes.
Jet-lagged and exhausted, we went to sleep early. For the first time in months, I fell into a deep, nightmare-free slumber. I dreamed instead about my grandfather as a boy, about his first night here, a stranger in a strange land under a strange roof, owing his life to people who spoke a strange tongue. When I awoke, sun streaming through my window, I realized it wasn't just my grandfather's life that Miss Peregrine had saved, but mine too, and my father's. Today, with any luck, I would finally get to thank her. After breakfast we left the pub and walked through town, dodging tractors and shouting to each other over the din of generators, until the streets gave way to fields and the noise faded behind us. It was a crisp and blustery day, the sun hiding behind giant cloud banks, only to burst out moments later and dapple the hills with spectacular rays of light. And I felt energized and hopeful. We were heading for a rocky beach, where my dad had spotted a bunch of birds from the ferry. I wasn't sure how we would reach it, though. The island was slightly bowl-shaped, with hills that climbed towards its edges only to drop off at precarious seaside cliffs. But at this particular spot, the edge had been rounded off, and a path led down to a minor spit of sand along the water. We picked our way down to the beach, where what seemed to be an entire civilization of birds were flapping and screeching and fishing in tide pools. I watched my father's eyes widen.
Fascinating.
He muttered, scraping at some petrified guano with the stubby end of his pen.
I'm going to need some time here. Is that all right?
I'd seen this look on his face before, and I knew exactly what some time meant. Hours and hours. Then I'll go find the house by myself.
No, you aren't. You promised.
Then I'll find a person who can take me.
Who?
Kev will know someone. Kev was out running an errand, and because asking one of his drunken regulars to chaperone me seemed like a bad idea, I went into the nearest shop to ask someone who was at least gainfully employed. The door read Fishmonger. I pushed it open to find myself cowering before a bearded giant in a blood-soaked apron. He left off decapitating fish to glare at me, dripping cleaver in hand, and I vowed never again to discriminate against the intoxicated.
What the hell for? Nothing over there but bogland and balmy weather.
He growled when I told him where I wanted to go. I explained about my grandfather and the children's home. He frowned at me, then leaned over the counter to cast a doubtful glance at my shoes.
You'll be wanting proper footwear. Wouldn't do to let you go in them trainers. What'll suck them right off.
Really? Are you sure?
Just so happens we got some good sturdy boots on offer. Buy one, get none free.
He burst out laughing and slammed his cleaver on a salmon, its head shooting across the blood-slicked counter to land perfectly in a little guillotine bucket. I fished the emergency money that had given me from my pocket, figuring that a little extortion was a small price to pay to find the woman I'd crossed the Atlantic to meet. I left the shop, wearing a pair of rubber boots so large my sneakers fit inside. I continued along a path that wound through pastures of grazing sheep before a lunge-busting ascent up a ridge, trying to figure out what I would say to Miss Peregrine when I met her. I was expecting to be introduced a proper Welsh lady and sip tea in the parlour and make polite small talk until the time seemed right to break the news. I'm Abraham Portman's grandson, I would say. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but he's been taken from us. Then, once she'd finished quietly dabbing away tears, I would ply her with questions. At the top hovered an embankment of rolling, snaking fog so dense it was like stepping into another world. It was truly biblical. A fog I could imagine God, in one of his lesser wraths, cursing the Egyptians with. As I descended the other side, it only seemed to thicken. The sin faded to a pale white blue. Moisture clung to everything, beating on my skin and dampening my clothes. The temperature dropped. A vast lunar bog stretched away into the mist from either side of the path, just brown grass and tea-colored water as far as I could see, featureless, but for the occasional mound of pile-up stones. It ended abruptly at a forest of skeletal trees, branches spindling up like the tips of wet paintbrushes. And for a while the path became so lost beneath fallen trunks and carpets of ivy that navigating it was a matter of faith. I wondered how an elderly person like Miss Peregrine would ever be able to negotiate such an obstacle course. She must get deliveries, I thought, though the path looked like it hadn't seen a footprint in months, if not years. I scrambled over a giant truck slick with moss, and the path took a sharp turn. The trees parted like a curtain, and suddenly there it was, cloaked in fog, looming atop a weed-choked hill. The house. My grandfather had described it 100 times, but in his stories the house was always a bright, happy place, big and rambling, yes, but full of light and laughter. What stood before me now was no refuge from monsters, but a monster itself, staring down from its perch on the hill with vacant hunger. Trees burst forth from broken windows, and skins of scabrous vine gnawed at the walls like antibodies attacking a virus, as if nature itself had waged war against it. But the house seemed unkillable, resolutely upright, despite the wrongness of its angles and the jagged teeth of sky visible through sections of collapsed roof. I tried to convince myself that it was possible someone could still live there, run down as it was. Which means, like it or not, that I was going to have to knock. I gathered what scrawny courage I had and waded through waist-high weeds to the porch, all broken tile and rotting wood, to peek through a cracked window. All I could make out through the smeared glass were the outlines of furniture, so I knocked on the door and stood back to wait in the eerie silence, tracing the shape of Miss Peregrine's letter in my pocket. I'd taken it along in case I needed to prove who I was, but as a minute ticked by, then two, it seemed less and less likely that I would need it. Climbing down into the yard, I circled the house looking for another way in, taking the measure of the place, but it seemed almost without measure, as though with every corner I turned the house sprouted new balconies and turrets and chimneys. Then I came around back and saw my opportunity. A doorless doorway, bearded with vines, gaping and black, an open mouth just waiting to swallow me. Just looking at it made my skin crawl, but I hadn't come halfway around the world just to run away screaming at the sight of a scary house. I thought of all the horrors Grandpa Portman had faced in his life, and felt my resolve harden. If there was anyone to find inside, I would find them. I mounted the crumbling steps and crossed the threshold. Standing in a tomb-dark hallway just inside the door, I stared frozenly at what looked for all the world like skins hanging from hooks. After a queasy moment, in which I imagined some twisted cannibal leaping from the shadows with knife in hand, I realized they were only coats rotted to rags and green with age. I shuddered involuntarily and took a deep breath. I'd only explored 10 feet of the house and was already about to foul my underwear. Keep it together, I told myself. And then slowly moved forward, heart hammering in my chest. Each room was a disaster more incredible than the last. Newspapers gathered in drifts. Scattered toys, evidence of children long gone, lay skinned in dust. Creeping mold had turned window-adjacent walls black and furry. Fireplaces were throttled with vines, that had descended from the roof and begun to spread across the floors like alien tentacles. The kitchen was a science experiment gone terribly wrong. Entire shelves of jarred food had exploded from 60 seasons of freezing and thawing, splattering the wall with evil-looking stains. And fallen plaster lay so thickly over the dining room floor that for a moment I thought it had snowed indoors. At the end of a light-starved corridor, I tested my weight on a rickety staircase, my boots laying fresh tracks in layers of dust. The steps groaned as if woken from a long sleep. If anyone was upstairs, they'd been there a very long time. Finally, I came upon a pair of rooms missing entire walls, into which a little forest of underbrush and stunted trees had grown. I stood in the sudden breeze, wondering what could possibly have done that kind of damage, and began to get the feeling that something terrible had happened here. I couldn't square my grandfather's idyllic stories with this nightmare house, nor the idea that he'd found refuge here with the sense of disaster that pervaded it. There was more left to explore, but suddenly it felt like a waste of time. It was impossible that anyone could still be living here, even the most misanthropic recluse. I left the house feeling like I was further than ever from the truth.